Hola, soy Facundo Guadaño. Este es otro episodio de Diálogos y es muy especial. Estamos con el más que renombrado académico antropólogo Michael Gurven, que estuvo en varios portales, estuvo en BBC, en Clarín, pero lo que importa acá es que estamos estudiando la antropología desde una visión que en América Latina no se suele dar. Es la antropología naturalista y para mí es un honor estar con Michael Gurven hoy. ¿Qué tal, Michael? ¿Cómo estás?
Bien, gracias por invitarme y bueno, el gusto es mío estar ahí junto contigo y bueno, estoy contento de comunicar con ustedes.
Afortunadamente, Michael puede hablar español. Esto fue por muchísimo trabajo de campo en Bolivia, pero vamos a intentar hacer que las preguntas, o sea, esto puede ir para que nos estén escuchando, que esto puede ir a veces en español y en inglés según la facilidad que tengamos para poder comunicarlo. Pero bueno, para comenzar, ¿no? Vamos a poner bajo escrutinio, under scrutiny, la hipótesis del grandparent, ¿sí? Porque tu trabajo le da muchísimo o mucho apoyo a las transferencias intergeneracionales, ¿no? Lo que serían intergenerational transfers, pero también muestra muchísima complejidad. ¿Cuál sería el componente de la grandparent hypothesis que es descriptivo antes que causal? O sea, es descriptive rather than causal. ¿Y
Ujú.
cuál crees que es el mecanismo más robusto detrás de la longevidad humana que a veces nuestro campo, uh, our field, still underestimates?
Bueno, no estás empezando con cuál es tu nombre, las preguntas
Facundo.
muy fáciles. Ahora, bueno, vamos a ir directo entonces a la profundidad. Bueno, es buena pregunta porque uno puede ver los abuelos haciendo cosas, ¿no? Pero viven y tiene tiempo o tiene las ganas de ayudar a sus nietos. Pero ¿qué significa eso? Eso es como un efecto que puede justificar la sobrevivencia de esas personas o es una causa o es un efecto. Y es poco complicado entender y también es poco difícil entender o distinguir entre el origen de longevidad y el mantenimiento de longevidad cuando ya está hecho, como igual como bipedality, cuando su origen en contra el mantenimiento, puede ser que podemos usar nuestras manos, hacer muchas cosas, pero ese es el origen de por qué estamos con bipedality, o quizás no. Es similar en el asunto de los abuelos y la longevidad. Bueno, es una hipótesis, ¿no? Y hay varios subhipótesis, si es abuelas o abuelos o ambos, y cuál es su efecto. Tiene que ser algo por la fertilidad o sobrevivencia de sus hijos, nietos y otro parentesco para tener su efecto, ¿no? Si uno está ayudando a todos, eso es casi de perspectiva de selección natural, es casi como está ayudando a nadie, porque si todos ganan igual, tus genes no van a tener una ventaja en comparación a los otros genes. Entonces, yo diría que hay varios modelos que muestran que es posible que la ayuda que hacen los mayores puede ser suficiente para justificar su longevidad y también em, justificar que no están dando luz de nuevo, porque es otra cosa también, no solo que estamos viviendo varios años, pero que hay menopausia a los 50 más o menos, entonces uno está contribuyendo a fitness en manera aparte de nacimiento, aparte de tener más hijos.
Entonces, lo que podemos decir, y perdón la interrupción, pero que aparece un trade-off positivo en la cooperación. Ahora, el proxy de la cooperación, ¿crees que es distinto en hombres y mujeres?
Si ¿cuál es distinto?
If
Cooperación.
the cooperation as a proxy
Mm.
is different if we do a comparison between men and women.
Am, bueno, yo creo que el comportamiento, lo que hacen los varones y mujeres, es diferente, pero al nivel de fitness no estoy tan seguro que es tan diferente. O sea, quizás más fácil si intento en inglés. For example, I spent a lot of time studying cooperation and hunter-gatherers, especially, uh, the main game in town is acquiring food, right? So hunting and gathering, are some of the main games in town, and so the meat and the food that you're getting is also kind of like money. It's the big currency. And so when it was observed that meat is shared more widely than other foods, and men tend to target wild game more so than women, then, it was proposed that, well, men are sharing more than women, and that men might be specially interested in game because it's widely shared, and that they're seeking out a large audience, and that they might be attracted to admirers, potential mates, other things like that, and in a way that maybe there's fewer diminishing returns to that type of behavior for men versus for women. So it's the same arguments about status striving, in a way that are saying men are more interested in the benefits of status striving than women are. And, I think that's a bit short-sighted. First of all, we don't really know. Well, even if that were true, the benefits of status are not super clear. And so the benefits, and some of those benefits do manifest in terms of benefiting your kids and your family. So status striving isn't the same thing as only going for yourself or only, at the expense of your family. And so, but those studies had never really been done about, what are the ways that politicking, right? So if a guy spends, an hour in meetings with, or hanging out with other like political leaders in a community, is he just wasting time? Or is it some of the sort of political game, given the way the rules are set, that this is what you need to do to help maintain the flow of resources in a way that can still benefit your family? I think the short-sighted way is like, unless you're holding a baby and feeding and caring for that baby, like that's easily direct childcare. But uh, is hunting wild game that's shared widely in the community, that seems to be like something that is benefiting more others more than your own family. But it's just a different type of strategy because that strategy is partly also recognizing that on days when you don't have food, others are going to be sharing with you. And so in some ways it's like a type of insurance that you're buying for your family. So all of that was just to say that men and women are both cooperating, but the form of cooperation that they take seems to be a bit different. And I don't have such strong feelings that, all the benefits of grandparents are only coming from grandmothers or only the benefits are only coming from grandfathers. I mean, I think when you look kind of at both sexes, especially because there's such divisions of labor in lots of different cultures, traditional cultures, that you wouldn't expect all the resources to be flowing in exactly the same way. And so in some of my studies, I've looked at both what men and women are doing in ways that benefit their kin, and others have done comparative studies, Rebecca Sear and Ruth Mace, and I think you need to zoom out a little bit. That in, some studies it's grandmothers, some studies it's grandfathers, some studies it's the maternal grandmother, others it's the paternal grandmother. I think the big picture is that it takes a village to raise kids. And depending on the details in each culture, sometimes it might be, the maternal grandmother, sometimes it might be the paternal grandparents, sometimes it might be adult siblings. Um, and so, from the gene's eye perspective, it's really sort of the sum of all of these kin benefits that are flowing. It becomes hard to measure and hard to assess, and we like a simple story. And I think the grandmothering hypothesis was a simple story. I think it got a lot of people thinking. The typical focus on females was just because females are the ones that have children. And so there was I think that was a okay as an initial kind of attempt, but I think the big picture needs to kind of look at what many group members are doing and thinking about the overall kin contributions and how that might affect. Because the original question was about longevity and grandparenting and how do you assess a cause versus an effect. And I guess part of what I'm saying is that we don't really know how big the effect is. Like how big is the effect on fitness? The main thing that's been measured is just food production because food is easy to weigh. And you can weigh kids and see if they're gaining weight, losing weight, and you can ask or find out whether or not the food they were getting was from their parents or their grandparents. But grandparents do so many other things that have just not been measured. We know from old ethnographies all the things that older people do, but it's also more complicated to measure. So if you're the one that oversees all of the puberty rituals, and you have to give permission in order for people to use certain parts of the territory. What exactly is that fitness effect? It's a little bit complicated, but it clearly does matter. And so yeah, so I think on the benefit side, we're just still in the initial stages of trying to understand how big those benefits can be. But I also think what we don't understand, and this is not part of the conversation, but I've been trying to bring this up, is on the cost side. Because there's a point at which grandmoms aren't doing anything, right? They're net cost to the family, right? If you're frail and you can't move, you're not a helpful grandmother. And someone once asked me at a talk, isn't there a point at which grandma is worth more in calories herself? Like you should be eating grandmother rather than grandmother contributing food to others. Of course, it was a biologist who asked that question. Um, but the point was well taken that those benefits max out at some point. And that's partly, the theme of my book, Seven Decades, is that seems to max out around about 7 decades. And beyond that, grandparents are going to be probably net burdens rather than net benefits.
Okay, that was excellent. Yes, and there's no issue in talking in using English as as our language now.
Okay.
But continuing, you had like a like a paradigm breaker with a mismatch because your findings on inflammation, cardiovascular health, and body temperature basically complicated the classic mismatch narrative. So what I'm saying is, do you believe that the mismatch framework is reaching a point where it explains too little? And if so, what conceptual frameworks should replace it for understanding health in post-industrial context?
Hmm. Another good question. I think the mismatch framework is still useful. It's just usually more complicated than a simple story about mismatch. So in regards to inflammation, um, what exactly is the mismatch? Well, you could say that we have fewer infectious exposures now than we would have had in the past. Um, and so our immune systems are working a bit differently now. And it might very well be that, inflammaging, right? So that increase of inflammation with age, you know, it was believed to be a bit more of a human universal, not just because of our lifestyle now, more focused, inflammatory diets, and we're not as physically active and fewer infectious exposures. But one of the arguments was also that our cells just become senescent, and your senescent cells are emitting inflammatory proteins, and so that's contributing to the increases of inflammation. But I think what was really helpful to see that in the Chimane context in Bolivia, and now not just in Bolivia. So thank God it's not just, Chimane are the one exception. Many times I think the Chimane are just a stand-in because they've been well studied. So, the Chimane have the healthiest hearts. Well, they have the healthiest hearts because they were the only ones who were studied in a CT scanner. I think if the Aceh or the Hadza or many other groups, with similar, non-industrial lifestyles were put in the CT scanner, we would see the same thing. But now in the Orang Asli, so groups of indigenous people with various livelihoods in peninsular Malaysia, they also did not show this signature of inflammaging. So, in other words, inflammation was not appearing to increase with age. And when you take this, where it gets a little complicated, if you sort of the first principal component, in other words, like a sort of composite of immune function that is usually the inflammatory component, if you take that, in places like the US and Singapore, it does predict, diabetes, kidney disease, hypertension, the chronic diseases of aging. Again, linking inflammaging with the chronic diseases. So not only did we not really see a signature of inflammaging in Bolivia or in Malaysia, but that sort of composite measure also did not predict these chronic symptoms, these chronic ailments. So that to me suggests, yeah, there might be a mismatch, but I feel like mismatch is not going to be the explanation. I feel like mismatch is a overarching kind of framework that thinks, all right, what exactly is different? It's just a initial step for trying to investigate what might be different and what combination of things might be different. Um, I don't think it's like a all-inclusive explanation in any way. Yeah, I would say it's more of a framework for starting to investigate and generate hypotheses
Yes,
about.
it's like sorry to interrupt, but it will be like necessary conditions, not the sufficient conditions.
Correct. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, and well, that gives us
Okay.
a little more of predictability uh, regarding post-industrial context. But another thing that you did is that uh, like you did like a revision on the on the on how reciprocity works, because you started with food sharing models, and now we have 2 decades of longitudinal evidence. So this is great and this is massive. So which traditional assumption of delayed reciprocity is most incompatible with the empirical patterns that you've documented? I mean, what model of sharing actually fits real human behavior?
Well, you're not asking me any easy questions, are you?
No, not at all. No.
Um, Well, first of all, I wish I could answer your question in the sense that it's true that I've been collecting, 2 decades of longitudinal data, but I haven't been collecting longitudinal data on everything. So the food sharing studies that I did a couple decades ago, unfortunately, I haven't been collecting lifelong. I mean, wow, wouldn't that have been wonderful if I could have had lifelong data on sharing patterns and co-residence patterns and things like that. But no, unfortunately, I don't. It's more about the kind of health related data that is uh, longitudinal. Although I do have the data that I'd like to actually be able to test some ideas that, for example, uh, if food sharing and being cooperative really is like a form of insurance that helps smooth consumption and helps ensure that you have food on a day-to-day basis, then we could actually use our longitudinal health data uh, to test this. In other words, if you observe over many years that your weight is going all the way over, all over the place, that doesn't really suggest that you're really being buffered from the ups and downs of climate and, you know, production variance and that kind of thing. But if it's relatively smooth, then maybe, you as someone who shares widely might actually have less variation in your health, in your weight, because you're being buffered. Uh, and so it's a sort of different kind of question, but to me it's a really interesting one because it's like a direct test of, the effects of sharing and generosity as a way of garnering a reputation that means others are invested in you and are being cooperative with you. If that status striving, has its benefits in terms of as a form of insurance, then we could actually look at that signature of insurance using longitudinal data on health status and weight. So that would be a really fun thing. It's on my list of, papers I don't have time to write. If you have great grad students, send them my way. But yeah, I would love to do a study like that.
But
Um,
I was thinking, maybe this is going to be obvious, and maybe I'm not saying anything new here, but uh, maybe this assumption of you could be related with um, our modular brain or function about moral and how cooperation works and how it stimulates the amygdala and well, I don't know how to say it in English, but el estriado, when another parts of our brain. Um, do you think that there's like a strict relationship with the Santa Barbara school with what Toby and Cosmides said about moral and reciprocity, or is this something obvious and it's not interesting for your work?
no, I think, you know, I probably didn't fully realize it at the time, but I think, John Tupy was on the search committee that hired me, and I understood more why, that some of my work on reciprocity, I think, really fed nicely into some of, the ideas that they had been generating about how, essentially fundamental reciprocity is, and in ways that, it was just scratching the surface. I was coming at it all from the behavioral end. And, certainly, people talk about, the morality of acts that are done and not done, right? Like being stingy, not just in the groups I've worked with, but, throughout the ethnographic literature. I mean, that's a really harsh thing. No one wants to be thought of stingy. And if you're in a context where you're not really relying on other people, maybe that's not that big a deal, right? That plenty of people are willing to pay that cost and, so what? Call me stingy, but at least I'm doing well. But no, I mean, people are so dependent on other people in so many, interdependent ways in hunter-gatherer societies that that stigma looms large. And so, what that often means is that uh, people, um, there's not kind of a strict tit for tat kind of logic of reciprocity that seems to govern what people actually do. People seem to be a bit more generous than that, more lenient, because there's so many reasons why Facundo didn't share with me, right? Now, if you consistently don't share with me, then maybe it doesn't matter what the reason is. You're just not a great social partner. And I think, you know, in the last decade or so, Tubi and Cosmedes, had elaborated this thinking about welfare trade-off issues and, welfare trade-off ratios. And, again, just this idea of like, how invested are you in me and in our relationship? And behavior and food sharing is one component of that, which is the other thing too that was always difficult to look at empirically is, I can study food and I can see how it's flowing, but that's not exactly what people are always thinking about, right? They might be exchanging food for labor or food for favors, and on different time scales. And that reality that kind of shapes, people's thinking about their reliance on other people and whether it's a moral imperative to do
Well,
any particular behavior. I mean, that's, a much kind of a deeper kind of problem that has, to my opinion, still has not actually been well investigated in even in hunter-gatherer societies.
I cannot recall the name of the scholar now, but maybe this can like bring some light on it. But I think that coercion might be something. If we,
Mm.
for example, why are we voting in Argentina? In Argentina, it's mandatory to vote, or you will have a sanction. You will get a fine. So even if that is, even if the fine is low, or the government never does it, people still vote the same, because the thing is that um, they and this is what the study found, they have afraid to be like the ones that didn't vote, and when they are going to be asked, okay, did you vote? Oh no, I didn't. So the social coercion, the social pressure is another thing that could be regarding moral imperatives, and maybe this can be translated to food. Maybe I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, I think so too. And what is that social pressure? It's other people observing, watching, talking about you to others. It's affecting your reputation. And I think because, even in contexts where everyone knows each other, there's a dynamic character. Things are never the same, right? The Facundo I knew, 2 weeks ago might not be the same now. Now you have a new friend and you have, conflicts with other people. And so the people that you're holding in high regard now might not be the same as 2 weeks ago. And so I think that updated information and caring what other people say about you, and how that is reflected by your participation in various things from voting, um, to, participating in a group feast, that or helping clear a path, like in a public field. I mean, I think all of that stuff, plays out in terms of reputation, and that a lot of it in that pro-social domain always does kind of carry a sense of moral character. I mean, think about this, that, once someone does something bad, it's hard to look at their good acts anymore in the same way because everything gets colored by their bad character. I mean, number of politicians that once they, get caught with their hand in the cookie jar or doing, wayward things, all their good acts, as politicians sort of disappears and one questions their motives and so you lose credibility. So yeah, I do think the moral character of all those things underplays a lot of this. Now there is one interesting aspect of this. We with Clark Barrett and Steve Stitch and a couple other folks, Dan Fessler, some years ago, we were looking at different aspects of norms and actually, the morality uh, of different pro-social norms and norm violations. So like the idea that if someone accidentally poisoned the well and then people died from that and it was an accident, like but in that particular case, like if enough people die, people, at least what we found, no one cares if it was an accident or uh it's
Exactly,
not some.
exactly. Because yes, and because there are like some scholars that are about well, abogados. They are about
Yeah.
jurists, and they come from a psychological from evolutionary psychology thing like Owen or Zamboni, and of course we have a certain pattern, a certain set of configuration. But the way that we interpret that is different. So yes, who is going to be guilty when the water is poisoned? I mean, no one cares until someone dies, actually.
Right. And then, it might not have been your intent and it was an accident, so it doesn't necessarily predict you that you're a bad person or that you'd repeat it, but you might be stupid. I mean, there might be other reasons. Maybe you just have bad luck, and bad luck carries with you. And people. So I think there's good reasons. It's hard to believe that something like that can be just a pure accident because it's such a massive consequence. And so I think, yeah, in some of the small scale societies where we looked at, in those particular cases, no, people did not think that was fine and that person shouldn't be punished or anything like that, even when the intent wasn't there.
And something else regarding Western societies and not non-Western societies, that um, we can say that the midlife crisis is a weird artifact in I'm using the acronym weird
Hmm.
because your findings basically undermine the universality of the happiness of the U shape.
Yeah.
So in the midlife dip is specific to weird societies, but what does this imply about how evolutionary psychology generalizes mechanisms across cultures?
Yeah.
How is it?
Yeah. So, well, thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a good example, perhaps, of a mismatch that actually goes in the opposite direction, right? Usually the mismatch is that, like in hunter-gatherers, they don't have a health problem because of how they live, but weird societies, they do have a health problem because of our lifestyle. But in this particular case, if anything, hunter-gatherers are more likely, after midlife to be more depressed or well-being seems to be either level or to decline, whereas in Western societies, things seem to look better with age. And that's, one thing that I'd say about that, certainly these patterns don't come out of evolutionary psychology. In fact, I would say, because I'm an outsider coming into looking at well-being and happiness. Uh, I'm not a happiness researcher per se, but I just sort of didn't understand the U-shaped curve in that literature. And when I looked into it, there is no theory that generates a U-shaped curve. People have tried to come up with one post hoc, but it was really just empirical observations. So pure inductive exercise that, with 20,000 people, answering a question about on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied are you with your life? And it appears to look like a little bit U-shaped. So I think even in the West, people take, that little dip Is it really a midlife crisis, a midlife slump? How big or significant is it? Um, First of all, we what we know now, even apart from the work that I've done in the US and I think in maybe 20 other countries now, the left-hand part of the U shape looks very different, right? So it's not that, young adults are starting off happiest and then the happiness is declining toward the midlife slump, but now young adults are the most miserable across the entire life course, right? And their happiness or well-being is actually increasing for the rest of the life course. So you're still seeing this increase after midlife, but you're also seeing this increase from, late teens up until midlife in the US now after 2019. This has been observed. And so even Danny Blanchflower, who's one of the strongest proponents of the U-shaped happiness curve, is now documenting that that doesn't even exist anymore. Uh, but when there's no theory, then I feel like anything can change, and uh, so why did that part of the life course change versus the other part of the life course change? And so this is where I tried to start developing a theoretical approach for at least thinking about the second half of life that, under some conditions, I do think there are reasons why older adults might focus on the positive and, they gain perspective. They're no longer as competitive and striving for status and wealth, the same way that they might have been when they were younger. This notion that age kind of blunts your ambition and you learn to appreciate what you have rather than seeking what you don't. So there are all these elements, I think, of positivity that should promote greater satisfaction in your life, even in the case where, because the I guess the paradox is like, wow, not only is well-being increasing, but this is happening at ages when your health is declining, you're losing loved ones. But, and this is where the potential, well, part of it's mismatched, but part of it is cultural institutions. If you live in a country where there's a good safety net, you have good health insurance, good life insurance, workplace, compensation. If you're well buffered, and you can still make a living, even if your physical health is ailing, then all those positivities I mentioned might sort of trump the challenges you're experiencing, and well-being, appears to increase with age. But, if you live as a hunter-gatherer and your physical body is still the most critical aspect of being productive and valuable in your society, since everything done, often involves some level of mobility and physical capacity. And so this is why I think in hunter-gatherers, the physical health really is a strong predictor of well-being. And that's what's sort of driving the sort of age-related decline in well-being. The age effect sort of disappears once you account for people's physical health and their physical discapacidad, like their inability to be productive and useful to others.
But do you think that maybe this difference between uh, biology and culture the are more are actually like something like an obstacle to generalization, to theory? Because yes, we can, i I believe that maybe your proposal is theoretical, it can generalize. And of course, if a country has not any safety net for midlife adults or elders, well, yes, of course they are going to be depressed or even worse. But do you think that maybe these are particular cases? Like, yes, we can explain human behavior, but of course, if some conditions are here, of course, this will be different. But this does not take our theory as false. If you got what
Yeah,
I
I
try
think.
to say.
Well, yeah. So when it was believed that the U shape was universal, then and there was one study in chimpanzees and orangs that also found some evidence for a U shape when well-being was sort of rated by the caretakers of the apes. And this sort of was this I maybe then was implanting this idea that it's just biological, it's built in to the life course, right? And well, one, I think that's dangerous because well, one, there's not really again any theoretical understanding of why that might be the case. But also, if you just assume that people are going to be getting happier with age, then you're kind of ignoring all the places around the world where that's not true. And so, part of my pitch with some of this work was that, there's so much again of the, it was partly a weird problem, but even in studies that, in the global South, it was also often urban samples. And so, I think seeing the flexibility actually, it's not that, well, it's not all biology, it's culture, but that, everything is biology and culture. And so it's not terribly informative, but like culture can mean so many different things and biology can mean so many different things. And so in this particular case, I would say, yeah, what are the key things that you'd want to focus on if you were really interested in like are older people in this particular society or context doing well or doing poorly? You'd want to know, how are they making a living? Who are they surrounded by? Um, are they being buffered in various ways? Is there health care? Uh, and I think, the kind of obvious things. And these are all things that social scientists have been talking about as well. But, that U-shaped thing was actually kind of a weird thing for me because it turns out psychologists don't seem terribly interested in it. If anything, it's the economists that are most obsessed with this notion of the U-shaped curve. So I just found it not terribly useful framing. Um, and it was also an opportunity to kind of shine a light on the mental health in the global South because, now recent Lancet papers, are showing there's a lot of undetected, depression and anxiety all throughout, the global South that, in fact, rates might actually be higher there than in weird countries. And so, again, if you just think it's all about the U shape or it's just biological that you should be happier with age, then that's we wouldn't even look at that and focus on that. So yeah,
Okay,
I don't know if that
and
answers.
but I have something that it's global. Yes, but basically, and this is a complicated question, and I know because what does the global drop in average body temperature truly indicates about baseline inflammation and aging, and basically should body temperature be considered like a neglected biomarker marker or systemic health?
Yeah. Okay. Well, you did your homework here.
Of course, yes, of course, yeah.
And here I thought, we were only going to talk about the book. That would have been easier. Um, you know, Well, in the end, I can say I don't know exactly what body temperature means. I think because it's an indirect measure of things. It would sort of suggest that, okay, if the body's not working as hard as it used to, then things are better. But what are those things exactly? We tried to isolate it. And even when we adjusted for infection and, even inflammatory biomarkers, we still saw this effect that body temperature had declined over the last couple decades. And so, it so it's not clear that infection or inflammation is that much lower overall. But maybe people experiencing this infection now are more robust than they may have been in the past, and so their bodies are working less hard to mount immune response, or it's having, less effect. There were some hints that people maybe recover a little bit faster now from an infection than they would have, 20 years ago. So I would say it was a pilot study, if anything, right? Because we didn't design this study to test the effects of temperature. Uh, you know, should body temperature be taken? I mean, body temperature is taken as a vital sign every time you go to the doctor. If it looks normal or a little bit below normal, no one really says anything, but I don't know. I think it's still hasn't really been investigated, whether having how much lower is it than normal? Does that predict good things about your health? Maybe it does. But I think like all things, we had the similar thing. Well, there's a paper kind of been working on, there's been recent controversy over the use of BMI, body mass index, simply, weight over height squared. Um, on one level, it's not a great index it's used as an index of obesity, that if BMI is above a certain cutoff of 20, from 25 to 29, it's seen as overweight. And if it's 30 and above, then that is interpreted as obesity. And you can imagine if it's just weight over height, it's not distinguishing fat from muscle. So a bodybuilder is going to have a high BMI, but you wouldn't really say that they're obese, right? And so, how good is it as a measure of obesity? And it's also the issue too that if there's stigma to being labeled obese, then, in the effort of being overly cautious, do we do more harm by labeling people obese just based on BMI? And I think with all things, and there's new guidelines for what's called clinical obesity as a diagnosis and what should clinicians do. And again, it's a single metric. If someone had a BMI of 32, you wouldn't just automatically prescribe them drugs. You'd want to know, well, okay, they have above this cutoff for obesity, but are they a bodybuilder? Are they an athlete? Are they physically active? What does their blood pressure look like? What does their cholesterol look like? You'd want to do a little bit more testing because maybe someone is very healthy. And so the BMI, it's just maybe something to watch out for, but it doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. Uh, but it actually does turn out at the population level, at least, Chimane, we've looked with higher BMI do have higher body fat. So even though they're physically active and don't have much heart disease, higher BMI basically means higher body fat, and not just, the body fat you get from a weigh scale. We actually have body fat measures, from CT scans that we've done. And so we can look at the heart or the fat surrounding the heart and the fat surrounding the liver. And those are like very direct measures of problems that could, lead to, health issues, as you get older. And we find that higher BMI correlates with those things. Now, granted, it's at the population level, so every individual, you know, may needs to be treated as an individual. Um, but it also means that we shouldn't just discard BMI because I think it is still useful. And maybe body temperature might be the same way, that it shouldn't be discarded or ignored, but it also shouldn't be overly interpreted as one number that you're healthy or you're not healthy.
Oh, I was laughing because I was thinking it's basically like when someone is measuring poverty and it's about how much they earn, about the PPA, about poder adquisitivo, and that makes no sense because that people may not have um usable water, or like in Argentina, but you can say that you're measuring poverty, but you're not. But
Mhm.
that. in other, I was thinking something else, and I don't know if there's an answer to this. But do you think that there is a non-genetic variable that plays a larger causal role in our species evolution toward longevity?
Well, yeah, certainly, I would think. I do think, if you're making it to 110, you've got good genes. Uh, and to some extent, I think it's fun to talk to centenarians and find out what their views are on life and how to live a long life. But I don't necessarily think that's the advice we should be fo following because it might not apply to the rest of us, who most of us are probably not going to make it to 110. Those folks just have really good genes. But for the rest of us, yeah, for sure, all the lifestyle stuff matters the most. I mean, even the epidemiological stuff in Western countries, shows pretty consistent, simple like, 4 to 8 kind of lifestyle habits. If you were to do all those things, you could gain 20 extra years. If you're 40 and you do, 8 healthy habits, you have meaning in your life. You eat healthy, whole foods that are unprocessed. You minimize, heavy drinking, stay away from, heavy narcotics, be physically active, these kinds of things. You could gain, up to 2 decades of life expectancy if you're 40 years old. And if you do fewer of those things, you gain less. And certainly the older you are, you gain a little bit less. But there's benefits that seem to accrue at all ages. And those are all lifestyle oriented things. Those are not, genetic by any means. And we know because over rapid periods of time, even in the last 10 years, but especially the last 5 years, we've seen Chimane blood pressure changing. It's getting higher now. Their bad cholesterol, the LDL, is higher now than it was a decade or two ago. We're seeing more cases of diabetes. So clearly, the Chimane genome has not changed in the last decade, but we're seeing rapid changes. And so now it might be, we did have other work showing that there are signatures of selection in the Chimane, and they might have some protective alleles that affect their immune function, that affect, digestion and diet in ways that maybe have some protective effect, but it's small. It's very small relative to these large scale changes to the diet and lifestyle that we're seeing all over the world.
Voy a cambiar un poco a español porque creo que esto
Okay.
es muy importante, muy, muy importante para la disciplina y para quienes escuchan este podcast. Por mi parte, considero que hay una antropología pro Clifford Geertz y anti Clifford Geertz. Quisiera saber si coincidís con esto y al mismo tiempo si coincidís que la etnografía no es solo la antropología, sino que es la pieza de evidencia para poder hacer teoría antropológica.
Sí, bueno, si está preguntando si la etnografía es como la evidencia de formar
Because
hipótesis
because
y...
basically here in Argentina there's a tendency of saying, okay, anthropology is ethnography. And believe me, it's like that here. And I believe that's a huge mistake. And in
Mm.
in in other words, and I would like an answer in Spanish because I believe that there is like an pro Clifford Geertz anthropology and the non Clifford Geertz anthropology that I guess that you are in that trend.
Yeah, bueno, yo considero que la etnografía es una parte de antropología muy importante, pero no es lo mismo. Em, y también, ¿qué significa etnografía? Por ejemplo, mis colegas en sus clases ya no leen los etnógrafos, los etnografía de antes, ¿no?
Malinowski, ese.
Sí, casi ya no, solo para criticar. Ya no leen los clásicos sobre los Yanomamo o Trobriand Islanders. Em, entonces, están leyendo otra cosa y bueno, quizás, bueno, no solo mi universidad, pero el enfoque es mucho más en activismo. Eh, eh, y es una forma de antropología como bien diferente. Bueno, es obvio que esos libros estaban escritos en un tiempo diferente, pero tienen los detalles que son claves y son cosas que uno no puede volver y, y, y ver con los ojos porque ya casi no existen los costumbres y el comportamiento y ahora en comparación como antes. Entonces, de eso vino Ahrefs y varias maneras de como usar esa información en una manera ah, muy clave. Lo interesante o chistoso, yo creo que era Clifford Geertz o quizás era Marvin Harris por social media, ha escrito algo criticando que la gente ya no leen etnografía como antes, que los estudiantes de antropología ya no saben qué es Hexaro, long distance, cooperative exchange in the Kung, ya no leen Mouse, The Gift, y cosas así, y están perdiendo mucho como antropólogos. Entonces, bueno, y los únicos que leen los clásicos de etnografía, irónicamente, son los evolutionary anthropologists or the more quantitative oriented anthropologists, los antropólogos que, bueno, y no es porque son racistas y no entienden el contexto de esos libros. You take it for what it is. Um, it's our best glimpse of the broader ethnographic record, right? And that there's so much cross-cultural work that has been done using the ethnographic record. And ironically, again, the people who have picked up testing big ideas in cultural anthropology right now are economists, in this whole subfield of cultural economics. I feel like they're doing a lot better job than anthropologists are in testing anthropological ideas. So yeah, that's been a big misfortune that ethnography means something different now. Um, but then also, right, the whole goal of anthropology isn't just to write an ethnography, right? That anthropology it's the study of the human condition, human nature, human behavior, human psychology, human physiology. And so you want to be able to use as many tools as possible, right? We should never be limited to one thing. Um, and so, yeah, anyone who says anthropology is just this, run away.
Más que claro. Ahora, lo que me gustaría saber es cuál es tu posición respecto a Clifford Geertz y tu posición respecto a la antropología interpretativa o simbólica, que en América Latina es mainstream.
Ujú.
Quizás lo sea también en otras partes del mundo, de eso lo desconozco, pero quizás han sido, o en mi caso, he leído los journals erróneos y también creo que es un poco mainstream esa antropología.
Uf. Em, yo me gusta mucho el trabajo. que es bien claro y entendible. Em, y cuando yo voy a escuchar unas charlas, a veces de mis colegas o visitantes que vienen de esa escuela de antropología muy interpretiva, uno no entiendo cuál es su pregunta, qué quiere, qué meta tiene, dónde quiere llegar, eh, qué has aprendido, qué has hecho. Casi no entiendo nada. Y no solo porque soy tonto y no entiendo, es que a veces sí entiendo un poco lo que está haciendo, pero yo no veo mucho. ah, I don't want to get in trouble here. Ah,
No hace falta dar nombres, en absoluto. No, no, no.
bueno, no estoy dando nombres, es más que I feel, entiendo el sentido que hay mucho activismo y uno quiere mejorar el mundo, y, pero la presentación, la obra, el trabajo, tiene que ser entendible y tiene que ser útil en una manera más obvia. Y yo no veo eso en muchas cosas que he leído o he visto que viene de em, esa subescuela de antropología. Y yo creo que es un poco, it's swimming in a void. No está conectado. Bueno, yo puedo decir no está conectado a la ciencia, pero no está involucrando ah, otro, otra información. Por ejemplo, si digo esto, um, yo trabajo con varias personas que enfoquen en la salud, ah, cardiólogos, epidemiólogos, y el Instituto Nacional de Salud es como el instituto más grande de los estados, quizás del mundo, que enfoque en salud y provee los fondos para hacer muchos estudios. Y entonces, si uno está enfocado en salud, debe estar colaborando con personas que trabajan en salud. Pero ahora, por ejemplo, la antropología médica casi rechaza la ciencia, rechaza la medicina, es una crítica de eso, crítica de esa, y no está colaborando para mejorar los estudios de salud, porque está en un vacuum como otro que
A,
no está
a ver, como si entiendo, ¿no? Están como interpretando qué es lo que los pacientes sienten y no está explicando, ¿no?
bueno, bueno, si solo fue eso, eso puede ser útil, pero a veces lo que yo veo, hay mucha teoría que no concuerda mucho con algo útil. Entonces, si yo soy médico, ¿qué información que estás aprendiendo que va a ayudarme en entender mi paciente? Ah, yo creo que información cualitativa sobre los sentimientos o la cultura, costumbre de los pacientes, eso puede ser útil, pero para llegar a esa información, tú tienes que hacer surveys, preguntas y analizar la información en una manera que no hacen esas personas. Entonces, a veces yo he visto presentaciones donde el antropólogo ha conversado con dos personas y ya tiene una idea, una gran vista del mundo hablando con dos personas. Entonces, cuando uno ve, otro que está relacionado, cuando uno ve los redes de citaciones, quién está citando quién en en el mundo de ciencia y academia, y uno ve biological anthropology, ya está citando biología, química, física, y otros campos también está citando a ese
Bueno,
trabajo.
bueno, podrían citar a Newton o a Einstein también si quisieran, ¿no?
Sí, pero antropología más interpretativa es como en una cueva. No citan a nadie aparte de ellos mismos. Entonces, ¿cómo vamos a avanzar el estudio de los humanos si está enfocado en un círculo de,
Sí,
no sé,
entiendo, pero yo a lo que me refería es que a veces la antropología interpretativa cita a la biología, y por eso yo decía en chiste, as a joke, that they could cite Newton or Einstein as well if they know the answer. I mean, si no hay preguntas, si no hay hipótesis y ya saben la respuesta, pueden citar lo que sea.
sí. Bueno, en la forma de ser un poco más amable, no estoy tanto en contra si no hay hipótesis. Porque a veces hay hipótesis, pero no son bien hechos o no son bien obvio. A veces solo uno está explorando porque no se sabe suficiente para tener una hipótesis. Pero igual necesitamos información. Y esa información hay que recolectar en una forma sistemáticamente. Para mí, esa información es muy útil. Entonces, por eso hay mucho trabajo que no es evolutionary, pero es muy útil porque es información ah, recolectado sistemáticamente y yo puedo entender mucho sobre las personas entrevistado, pero un rechazo de ciencia es también un rechazo de la forma de recolectar información. Y eso para mí es más como problemático, porque yo creo que hay lugar para slow science, ¿no? Para entender, aprender. Por eso los ethnographies, the classic ethnographies son muy importantes. Y más antes, antropólogos cultural. eh, Parte de su entrenamiento y su trabajo fue entender algo de economía, la vida social, los rituales, que hacen la gente. Entonces, ellos recolectaron esa información. Ellos pesaron la comida que entraron a la familia. Ellos han hecho estudios de tiempo, uso de tiempo, presupuesto, time budgets, para entender qué hacen la gente. Eh, pero ya no hacen eso, ya no hacen nada de eso. Y para mí eso es más problemático, no solo que no hay hipótesis, pero no hay un respeto para la recolección de información y también no están recolectando la información que puede mostrar que un antropólogo está incorrecto, que no sabe lo que está pasando. Right? Muchas veces, bueno, yo estaba como parte de NSF, de Instituto Nacional de Ciencia, para evaluar becas. Y a veces el S significa ciencia, pero si alguien dice tiene una propuesta que es bien interpretativa, ya sabe lo que va a ver, ya sabe todo. ¿Por qué esa persona necesita la beca? ¿Por qué esa persona tiene que hacer el estudio si ya está interpretando todo lo que en una manera que quiere? Entonces, no está mostrando que quizás puede ser equivocado y puede ser que la verdad es diferente de lo que piensa. Pero no va a evaluar esto si no está recolectando información que puede mostrarte que no tiene sentido tus ideas. Bueno,
Yo igual, sí, lastimosamente bueno, nos estamos quedando sin tiempo y hay otras obligaciones también. Pero para cerrar y agradeciendo todo el tiempo que has tenido, me gustaría saber si una impresión mía es correcta o no. La antropología interpretativa es el mainstream ahora, ¿no? En términos globales, digo, ¿no? Y la antropología, vamos a decir, naturalista, no lo es.
¿cuál es la pregunta? Si la antropología
I mean, if
naturalista
if
en vez de...
interpretive or symbolic anthropology is mainstream, and
Ah,
naturalistic or scientific or psychology anthropology, ho- however you want to call it, um, that is
well,
not the mainstream at all.
well, I mean, even if something is mainstream doesn't make it right or doesn't make
No,
it
no,
better.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
And certainly, the AAAs, our American Anthropological Association, has many anthropologists that, subscribe to more, interpretivist kind of anthropology. And so there probably are many more of those kinds of anthropologists. And they're not all anthropologists, right? They're dispersed in many fields. Here we have global studies, we have communications, multiple departments where it looks sort of indistinguishable to me as kind of more interpretivist kind of work. Uh, and the cynic in me could say there's more of them because it's easier, right? I mean, if hell, I could just write about, whatever I think and feel and not, I mean, I don't know. I'm being a little glib here. Um, but so yeah, there are more anthropologists, I think, following that tradition than there are people like me, I think. And one thing is that there's more people like me now that are coming out of biology departments. Human biology, being, in the past, if you studied humans, it was like you don't belong in a biology department. That's not true in England. So people like me in England typically are in biology departments. There's only a handful of places that have evolutionary anthropology as uh, in anthropology. Um, but yeah, I think, even that sort of old school cultural anthropology, economic anthropology, human ecology, doesn't seem to exist in the same way now that used to be. Medical anthropology, it's all kind of become a bit more, I would say more interpretivist, less kind of testing ideas, less systematic, less scientific. Um, and I think, it's it's one of the reasons that anthropology probably isn't taken as seriously by the rest of the sciences. And, there's a reason why economics, gets the most respect. And I think, with all good things, right, there's good lessons to come out of a lot of the interpretivist work. But it shouldn't come at the expense of rejecting all the scientific work, right? Again, why not blend and more tools on your tool belt, the better, right? So take the ideas that came out of interpretivist anthropology and combine them to do better science. That's not happening, right? Well, actually, it's happening a little bit, but it's happening within the sciences. It's happening, in this more naturalistic kind of anthropology. It's not happening within the interpretivist anthropology.
Michael, te agradezco muchísimo el tiempo, la verdad que ha sido una charla maravillosa. Me gustaría continuarla porque sé que nuestros horarios son apretados. Prometo enviarte papers que te van a interesar y sugiero, por favor, a todos los que están escuchando esto, la antropología no es solo interpretar, no es solo interpretar significados o lo que la gente cree, hay mucho más y no le tengan miedo a la palabra biología, no le tengan miedo. Sé que es un tabú en América Latina, pero no le tengan miedo. En fin, muchas gracias, Michael.
Muchas gracias, Facundo, y bueno, fue un placer.